The sun dipped low over the Atlantic horizon, casting a soft orange glow over John F. Kennedy International Airport. The summer air of July 17, 1996, was thick, humid, and restless, at the kind of evening where the sky seemed endless and the sea below waited silently. Inside Terminal 5, the departure boards flickered to life with another transatlantic journey, ATRAN's World Airlines Flight 800. Bound for Paris. It was supposed to be routine for the 130 passengers and 17 crew members. It was the start of vacations, honeymoons, homecomings, and business trips. No one could know that within just minutes of takeoff, the night sky off Long Island would ignite in one of aviation's most haunting tragedies. In the quiet hum of the terminal, families hugged goodbye. Parents reassured anxious children. Couples exchanged soft smiles. The aircraft waiting on the ramp, a Boeing 747-131A, stood massive, almost regal, under the evening light. Registration N93119, 25 years of service. A veteran of countless flights, and yet still strong, still steady, its engines glistening under floodlights. The ground crew moved around it like clockwork, loading bags, checking panels, fueling tanks. Everything looked perfect. Everything seemed fine. Captain Ralph Kevorkian, a seasoned pilot with thousands of hours in the air, walked toward the jet, his uniform crisp, his expression calm. Alongside him was First Officer Stephen Snyder and Flight Engineer Richard Campbell. Together, they formed an experienced crew, professionals who had seen countless flights take off and land safely. In the cabin, Senior Flight Attendant Jill Loftus and her team prepared for boarding, rehearsed routines, checked equipment, and smiled through the motions that came with every departure. At 7 p.m., boarding began. Passengers filed in, some tired, some excited. A group of high school students on a French club trip laughed in their seats, taking photos. An engaged couple held hands by the window. Business travelers adjusted ties and opened newspapers. One mother calmed her baby as the flight attendants assisted with overhead bins. Seatbelts clicked. Air conditioning hummed. The smell of jet fuel and new carpet filled the cabin. It was a picture of normalcy. At 8 p.m., the doors were closed. The jetway retracted. The engines began to spool. The roar of 4 Pratt Whitney JT9D engines rolled across the tarmac. The plane slowly taxied to runway 22R. From the cockpit, the world looked peaceful. The sky to the west glowed with the last colors of dusk. On the radio, the calm voice of air traffic control cleared them for takeoff. TWA 800, cleared for takeoff. Runway 22 right. Captain Kevorkian acknowledged. Cleared for takeoff. 22 right, TWA 800. His voice was steady, measured, routine. At 8:19 p.m., the aircraft rolled forward, gathering speed, heavy with fuel and promise. The vibrations of the runway faded as the giant lifted off, its wheels retracting into the belly of the machine. Below, the lights of Long Island grew smaller, the ocean ahead infinite. They climbed through 10,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled in. The seatbelt signs blinked off. Flight attendants began preparing for the meal service, moving gracefully between aisles, unaware that time was slipping faster than anyone could imagine. The cockpit conversation was ordinary. They discussed weather, routes, radio frequencies. Nothing unusual, nothing at all. The aircraft continued its climb toward cruising altitude. At 8:25 p.m., the crew contacted Boston Center, reporting their altitude and course. TWA 800, climbing through 13415, direct Dorado. Roger. TWA 800, radar contact. The exchange was simple, mechanical at the heartbeat of every flight. But at 8:31 p.m., everything changed. Somewhere around 13,700 feet, over the dark waters off Long Island, witnesses along the coast looked up. Some were fishermen, some were vacationers standing on decks. They saw a streak of light, a bright flash rising into the night sky. Some thought it was fireworks. Others thought it was a flare. And then came a second flash, a brighter, violent, orange. Within seconds, the sky erupted into fire. The sound followed, deep and thunderous, echoing across the waves. Pieces of light rained down, fragments, glowing embers, tumbling into the sea. For a brief moment, the Atlantic horizon became a burning scar. Inside the cockpit, there was no warning, no mayday call, no final message. The flight data would later show that everything ended in a fraction of a second. One moment, the instruments were normal. The next, silence. The last transmission recorded was calm and ordinary, a routine acknowledgement to air traffic control. And then nothing. The radar screen at Boston Center blinked, and TWA 800 disappeared. Controllers tried to re-establish contact. TWA 800, Boston Center. Silence. TWA 800, radio check. Silence. In the control room, eyes turned to the radar. The blip was gone. They checked coordinates, radio frequencies, possible transponder errors. Within minutes, reports began to flood in from the coast. We saw an explosion. There's fire on the water. Something just fell out of the sky. It was 8:31 p.m. The Atlantic was burning. Coast Guard stations scrambled rescue boats. Helicopters lifted off into the night, their searchlights sweeping across the waves. What they found was unimaginable. The surface of the water was covered in floating debris, seats, luggage, fragments of fuselage still smoldering. The air was thick with fuel vapor. The sea carried the faint smell of jet fuel and fire. And amidst it all, silence. No survivors. The impact had been instant, total, merciless. 230 souls lost in less than a heartbeat. News of the disaster spread rapidly. Within hours, the world knew that a 747 bound for Paris had exploded off Long Island. Television stations cut to breaking news. Families waiting in Paris were told to move to private lounges. At JFK, relatives gathered in disbelief. Some clutched photographs, others prayed. The night turned to chaos, grief, and unanswered questions. No one knew why a massive jet, in perfect weather, could simply vanish in flames. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest and most controversial in aviation history. The National Transportation Safety Board, the FBI, the Navy, and hundreds of divers and technicians converged on the site. Over the coming months, they would recover more than 95% of the aircraft from the ocean floor. Piece by piece, each fragment was catalogued, cleaned, and reassembled inside a massive hangar in Carverton, New York. Slowly, the shape of the 747 emerged, a twisted, broken, and burned a ghost of what had once soared. At first, speculation ran wild. Witnesses described seeing a streak of light rising toward the aircraft before the explosion. Many believed it had been struck by a missile. Theories spread like wildfire: a terrorist attack, a naval accident, a mechanical failure. The United States was still on edge from recent bombings and growing fears of terrorism. The idea of a missile strike felt chillingly plausible. But investigators knew that the truth in aviation is rarely simple and never fast. Over months of analysis, they studied the wreckage, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data. The recorders revealed nothing unusual. The last words were calm, the instruments normal. There was no warning, no sound of explosion before the breakup. The focus turned to the heart of the aircraft at the center wing fuel tank. Investigators found evidence of intense internal explosion in that area. The metal was bowed outward. The wiring showed signs of short-circuiting. The fragments told a silent but powerful story. The explosion began inside the tank itself. The center fuel tank of a 747 sits beneath the passenger cabin, between the wings, partially filled with jet fuel and vapor. On that warm July evening, as the air conditioning packs beneath it generated heat, vapors accumulated, a highly flammable, invisible, deadly. A single spark from aging electrical wires could have ignited it. And when it did, it tore through the tank with devastating force. The blast ripped the fuselage apart. The nose section separated instantly. The wings disintegrated. The aircraft broke into pieces before anyone could react. It was over before the crew could even reach the radio. For years, Controversy lingered. Conspiracy theories persisted. Some witnesses insisted they saw something rise toward the plane. The missile theory refused to fade. But science, metallurgical evidence, and exhaustive testing told a different truth. A tragic mechanical flaw, a moment of electrical failure, and a volatile mix of fuel vapors that needed only the smallest spark. No malice, no attack, just physics, probability, and cruel timing. The reassembled wreckage became both a puzzle and a memorial. Investigators walked among the twisted beams and burned panels, touching the evidence of 230 lives lost. Each seat number represented a story, a face, a laugh, a promise left unfinished. There was the row where the French students had sat together, full of laughter. The seats where a couple dreamed of Paris. The empty cockpit, silent forever. Even hardened investigators paused, often in silence, overwhelmed by the weight of what they saw. In the months that followed, recovery crews worked tirelessly to bring closure to families. Every personal item, a shoe, a photograph, a wedding ring, was carefully catalogued and returned. Memorial services were held along the coast. Candles flickered in the night. The sea that had taken so much now held memories that could never be erased. Parents wept for children. Lovers mourned for partners. The names of the lost were read one by one. The world moved on, but for those who had loved them, time stopped on July 17. The tragedy of TWA Flight 800 changed aviation forever. The investigation led to new safety regulations, better wiring standards, fuel tank inerting systems designed to prevent vapor explosions, and stricter maintenance protocols for aging aircraft. From disaster came progress, lessons written in pain, learned in blood. The industry vowed never again to allow heat and vapor to conspire in silence. Years later, the reconstructed fuselage of TWA 800 was moved to the NTSB Training Center in Virginia, used to teach future investigators how to read the silent language of wreckage. It stands there still, not as a spectacle, but as a teacher, a steel reminder of fragility, precision, and respect for every life that steps aboard an airplane. For those who remember, the images remain: a summer night, a streak of light, the ocean on fire, the last ordinary transmission of Flight 800 echoing in the dark, routine words spoken by professionals doing their job. Then, silence. Behind that silence lay the stories of everyone aboard, a laughter frozen in time, conversations cut short, destinies rewritten by a single spark. Sometimes, history is not defined by what is said, but by what is lost in the noise between words. The passengers of TWA 800 never knew they were part of a chapter that would reshape aviation safety. Their final journey, though brief, left behind a legacy of learning and remembrance. Each flight since carries a piece of their story: the unseen safety measures, the improved systems, the awareness that every checklist and every inspection is written in remembrance of those who came before. As night settles again over Long Island, the ocean moves quietly. Beneath its surface lie the faint echoes of that summer night, fragments of metal now part of the seabed, stories forever entwined with the waves. Above, the sky that once burned bright has healed, stars returning to their silent vigil. But for those who still remember, the air carries whispers, a distant radio call, a captain's calm voice, the hum of engines fading into eternity. The last transmission of TWA Flight 800 was not a cry for help, not a warning. It was simply routine, a sign that everything was normal, that the sky was safe. And perhaps that's the greatest tragedy, how ordinary the final moments seemed, how peaceful the voices sounded, unaware that in mere seconds, the world would change. Every flight since carries that memory silently. Every passenger who looks out over the ocean, watching the lights fade beneath the clouds, travels in the shadow of those who never arrived. The story of TWA 800 is not just about loss, but about the fragile beauty of flight, how something so powerful can vanish so quietly, how a journey can become a legacy in the blink of an eye. Tonight, as airliners climb once more into the same skies, their contrails glinting in the fading light, somewhere between the waves and the stars, the memory of Flight 800 endures, not as an explosion, not as debris, but as a reminder that every takeoff carries trust, that every safe landing is a miracle built on lessons written in tragedy, and that behind every flight number are lives, stories, and voices that deserve never to be forgotten.